Sit still for a moment. Don't rush. If you can lower the volume of your thoughts, the way you would before listening to a story at night, because this story is not meant to comfort you. It is not told to reassure you that everything will be fine. It does not promise a kiss powerful enough to erase years of captivity. It does not insist that love always arrives on time or in the right form. This is not a story of salvation. This is a story about what remains after all the promises have collapsed. And if you think you already know Rapunzel, if the image in your mind is of a beautiful girl with long golden hair, a tall tower, and a clean, satisfying ending, then you are entering the story with the same innocence that many others have carried before you. That innocence will not make it to the end. It cannot. Rapunzel is often told as a cautionary tale, a story with its sharp edges filed down smooth until it fits comfortably in a child's hands. A story where evil has a clear shape, where good is rewarded and bad is punished, where pain is temporary and love stitches everything back together. But fairy tales did not begin that way. They were not born to soothe. They were born in dark kitchens, during long evenings when people whispered to one another about things that had happened and could never be undone. These stories do not offer reassurance. They issue warnings, and the version of Rapunzel you are about to hear is not a magic story. It is a debt story, about one person making a choice and another person living an entire life with the consequences of that choice. Some crimes do not end when the act is over. Some crimes do not require blood in order to exist. They only require time. They cling to stone walls, to flesh, to memory. They remain in the smallest habits, in the way someone looks toward a window, in the way someone grows afraid of silence. This is what gentler versions never tell you. They show you the moment of wrongdoing, then hurry you away, as if looking elsewhere long enough will make everything disappear. But in this story, we do not look away. We stay. We stay long enough to see that some choices, once made, never release anyone connected to them. You may think Rapunzel is a victim, and you would be right, but this story does not begin with her. It begins earlier, in a garden, with a very ordinary person, not a monster, not a demon, just someone afraid. And that is the most unsettling part. The most frightening stories rarely begin with something grotesque. They start with something deeply human, a craving, a justification, a quiet promise to oneself, just this once. You will hear that promise repeated throughout this story in many different forms. Everyone has a reason. Everyone believes they are doing what is necessary. And those reasons are what built the tower. When we think about crime, we tend to imagine explosions, a knife, a scream, a single undeniable act. But Rapunzel did not live inside a crime like that. She lived inside a chain of small decisions, so reasonable they became terrifying. Decisions wrapped in the language of love, protection, and responsibility. And that is why years later, even standing in freedom, she is not always sure she has the right to hate. Because when someone says they did everything for you, calling it a crime becomes far more difficult. If you are listening to this story in search of a villain to condemn, you may be disappointed. This story does not give you a simple evil. It gives you uncomfortably familiar people. A father who loves his wife, a woman terrified of being abandoned, a young man convinced that his desire is noble, and a girl who grows up never knowing the world could be different. Every one of them does what they believe is right, and every one of them leaves marks that cannot be erased. You may wonder why this story must be told this way. Why must it move so slowly? Why does it linger in the darkness for so long? The answer is simple, because we live in a world still full of towers without doors. They are not always made of stone. Sometimes they are built from excessive care, from gentle words that lock instead of open, from fear disguised as love. And if we only tell stories where everything is neatly resolved, we will never recognize where we are standing inside the unfinished ones. So before we go any further, I want you to hold onto a small, uncomfortable feeling somewhere in your chest. the feeling that you may not be entirely outside the story, that at some point in your life, you too may have believed a wrong choice was necessary, that you may have been protected so thoroughly you were not allowed to leave. This story does not come to accuse you. It comes to remind you that the most dangerous crimes rarely wear the face of monsters. They arrive with familiar voices, with reasonable explanations, with promises that everything will be fine. And if you are still willing to continue, if you are ready to hear a Rapunzel that has not been softened, not been rescued, then we will begin where everything truly starts, not with the tower, not with the hair, but with a garden and a man too weak to face the consequences of the choice he is about to make. When the story returns to the first person who placed the foundation stone for everything that would follow, it does not begin with an action, but with waiting. The man lived in a small house at the edge of the forest, far enough to avoid notice, close enough to see the garden, beyond the high wall whenever the afternoon light began to fade. At first, he paid little attention to it. It was just a garden like many others, thick with vegetables and herbs. But then his wife became pregnant, and as the child grew inside her, a craving took shape alongside it, strange, persistent, and unwilling to let go. It did not arrive like ordinary hunger. It arrived like a thought that took root, repeating itself day after day, night after night, until it occupied every corner of the small house. She lay in bed, growing thinner by the day, her eyes fixed on the window where the garden rested in silence, green and flourishing to the point of insult. She spoke very little, and when she did, it was always about one thing: that plant, growing in that garden, nowhere else. At first, the husband laughed it off, telling himself it was just another passing craving of pregnancy. But as the days passed, his wife's whispers grew weaker, her skin paled. Her breathing became shallow, and the craving did not fade. It sharpened. It lodged itself in his mind like a blade being honed. He began standing by the window, longer staring at the garden, at the rows of plants, dense, vibrant, unnaturally healthy. That garden was not like the others. It was too quiet. No birds perched there. No insects moved through it. Everything inside seemed suspended as though waiting. He told himself he was only looking, that looking was not a crime. But each time his gaze crossed the high wall, a small thought surfaced, was pressed down, then rose again with more force. Just a little, just once. He knew exactly who the garden belonged to. Everyone did. The woman who lived alone behind that wall received no guests, sold, nothing, spoke to no one. Her name was spoken in lowered voices, as if saying it aloud might invite misfortune. People avoided the garden, not because it was forbidden, but because it felt wrong to enter. And so every time his wife whispered, pleaded, said she would die without that plant, a weight settled on his chest. He was not a fool. He knew stealing was wrong. He knew the consequences could be severe. But he also watched his wife weaken day by day, and the unborn child became a fading shape caught between two fears. On the first night, he did not climb the wall. He only went outside and stood there for a long time before the cold stone, his hand pressed against its rough surface, feeling the damp seep into his skin. He heard his heartbeat in his ears, the sound of his own breathing. The garden beyond was so silent it made him feel watched, not by eyes, but by presence. He returned home telling himself he would find another way in the morning, that he would reason with his wife, that there would be a solution. But morning came. The craving did not lessen, and his wife's eyes sank deeper. On the second night, he stood before the wall again, longer this time, and this time he climbed. His hands trembled as they gripped the stone. He told himself he would be quick, that he would take very little, that no one would know. When his feet touched the ground on the other side, a chill ran down his spine. The air inside the garden felt heavier, thicker. He moved carefully between the rows, trying to leave no trace. When he pulled the first leaves free, they came away with startling ease, as though they had been waiting to be taken. He stuffed them into his coat, turned to leave, and in that moment, he felt the garden exhale slow and deep. He returned home and gave the plants to his wife. She ate in silence, tears sliding down her face. Color returned to her skin with frightening speed. He felt relief. He told himself he had done the right thing, but the craving did not stop. It returned the next night, and the night after that. Each time, climbing the wall became a little easier. His hands no longer shook the same way. He knew the path. He knew where to take from without leaving an obvious gap. The crime was no longer a single moment. It became a habit, a midnight ritual. He no longer asked himself whether he should do it. He only wondered how many more nights he could manage before everything collapsed. And through all of it, the garden remained silent. It did not resist. It did not warn. It simply stood there, abundant and patient. The most frightening part was not that he stole. It was then that he began to believe he had the right to. That his wife's life, the life of the child inside her, outweighed any rule. That the garden was so plentiful, no one would notice such a small loss. That thought, repeated night after night, formed a debt not written down, not spoken aloud, but growing heavier with every bundle of leaves he carried home. And while he believed he was saving his family one night at a time, somewhere in that silent garden, a balance was being disturbed. There was no thunder, no curse spoken aloud, only time and a price waiting to be claimed. On one particular night, when he climbed the wall with a confidence that had become familiar, he felt none of the fear that once stopped him. And it was precisely in that moment, when fear disappeared, that his crime fully ripened. He did not know that each step he took into the garden was not only taking leaves, but tightening an invisible thread around the fate of a child not yet born. He did not know that the garden in all its silence had remembered. And like everything properly planted, this debt would one day be harvested. The man could not say exactly which night the silence of the garden began to change. There was no clear sign, no strange sound, no figure appearing between the rows of plants. But one night, as he climbed over the wall with movements that had become almost automatic, he felt something was different. The air seemed thicker, heavier, pressing against his chest, until every breath required effort. He still bent down to pull the leaves, still tucked them inside his coat, but the sense of being watched was no longer vague. It was precise, concrete, impossible to dismiss with reason. He left the garden faster than usual, his heart pounding, telling himself it was exhaustion that his mind was playing tricks on him. Yet when he returned home and saw his wife eating with the familiar look of relief, the comfort he once felt did not come. Some part of him understood that the silence had never been forgiveness. It had been waiting. The following night, when he climbed the wall again, she was there. Not emerging from the shadows, not appearing suddenly like a nightmare. She was simply standing in the center of the garden, where the moonlight fell clearly enough to reveal her shape. The man froze, his hands still gripping the cold stone. For a brief moment, he considered turning back and running, but the thought died the instant her gaze met his. There was no anger in her eyes, no surprise, only recognition, as though she had known he would come, had known he would stand in that exact place, on that exact night. She did not shout. She did not call for help. She did nothing he had rehearsed in his fear. She only looked at him, and it was that calm that caused his legs to weaken. "Have you taken enough?" She asked, her voice even neither raised nor lowered. It did not sound like an accusation. It sounded like a question in a transaction, already accounted for. The man opened his mouth, but could not speak. He knew that an apology would mean nothing now. He knew there was no way to deny what he had done. All the previous nights rushed into his mind like a trail of footprints that could not be erased. He began to speak about his wife, about the child, about the craving, about his fear of loss. He spoke quickly, desperately, as if the more words he used, the smaller his guilt might become. She listened. She did not interrupt. She did not show sympathy. She simply stood there, one hand resting lightly on a bed of plants, like someone inspecting her property. "Do you know what you have done?" she asked when he finally fell silent. The man nodded, but the gesture was hollow. He knew he had stolen, but he had never named it with heavier words. She stepped a little closer, close enough for him to smell earth herbs, and something older deeper beneath them. "You took what was not yours," she said, still calm, "and like all things taken, it must be repaid." The man rushed to say that he would pay. Money, labor, anything. He would work for the rest of his life. He would accept punishment. Anything as long as his wife lived. The words poured out before he could think. He believed he was negotiating, that this was the moment he could still fix everything. She shook her head so slightly it was almost imperceptible. "There are debts that do not require money," she said. "There are debts that do not require labor." She looked directly at him, and in her gaze, he realized for the first time that this was not a discussion. It was a declaration. Cold sweat ran down his spine as she continued, each word placed carefully, like stones being set. "When the child is born, she said it will belong to me." That moment stretched longer than any other in his life. He heard himself protesting, but the sound felt distant, distorted, as if it did not come from his own throat. He said it was impossible, that it was his child, that she could not demand a life in exchange for a handful of leaves. But even as he spoke, he felt how fragile his argument was. He had already been willing to trade so much to save his wife. Only now had the price been named. She did not argue. She did not need to. She simply waited patient, as though time itself stood beside her. "You may refuse," she said, "and your wife will die. The child as well." The world narrowed to two choices, both unbearable. He searched desperately for a third path, a loophole, an unspoken clause. He asked if it could be another child, if it could be later, if there could be some kind of substitute. Each question was met with silence, and in that silence, he understood that he was speaking to someone who did not need to persuade anyone. She was not in a hurry. She did not need his immediate consent. Time was her instrument, and time was already wearing him down. In the end, what made him nod was not logic, but the image of his wife, lying in bed, breathing weakly, her hand resting on her stomach. He told himself the unborn child knew nothing of the world yet, that it would not suffer the way an adult would. He told himself he could live with this pain, if it meant his wife would live. He told himself many things too quickly to realize he was deceiving himself. When he finally said yes, his voice so soft it barely existed, the garden seemed to exhale once more. There was no thunder, no manic laughter, only silence settling in, heavy and complete. She nodded like someone receiving the confirmation she required. "The agreement is made," she said. "I will come when the time arrives." Then she turned and walked deeper into the garden, disappearing among the lush green rows. The man stood there long after she was gone, his arms hanging uselessly at his sides, his mind emptied of thought. He did not remember how he climbed back over the wall to return home. He only remembered the silence clinging to him thick and dense, like a fog that refused to lift. In the days that followed, he said nothing to his wife. He did not know how to begin. Each time he saw her weak smile, after eating he felt an invisible blade cut into his chest. The debt now had a shape. It was no longer an abstract fear. It was a promise spoken aloud, a promise that could not be taken back. And inside that small house, among ordinary routines, a horrifying agreement had been sealed without ink or paper. The silence that followed his consent stretched outward, settling into every dark corner. It would not leave. It never would. The night the wife went into labor arrived without ceremony, without warning, only a dull ache at first that slowly tightened as though her body had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. The husband woke to the sound of her quiet moans in the darkness, thin and broken. Not the sound of sharp pain, but of someone too tired to resist what was coming. He helped her sit up, his hands shaking so badly he could barely tie the cord of her robe. What filled his mind was not the ordinary fear of a man about to become a father, but the sensation of approaching a point from which there was no return. Each contraction was another step toward the debt sealed in the garden, and he knew whether he wanted to or not that this was the night it would be paid. The small house quickly filled with the smell of sweat, candle wax, and fear. There was no midwife, No one was called. The husband dared not let another witness inside, as if one more pair of eyes would make the crime, about to unfold, too real, too heavy to bear. He did what he could, repeating clumsy motions he had once seen others perform, while his wife clutched his arm, her nails digging into his skin, leaving marks he knew he deserved. She did not scream. She clenched her teeth and endured as if some part of her already understood that crying now would change nothing. When the child was born, there was no wail like the one he had heard described. Only a soft breath, barely there, so fragile he had to lean close to be sure it lived at all. The baby was terrifyingly small, its skin dark red and wrinkled, as if it had not yet decided whether it truly wished to remain in this world. The husband lifted it with hands trembling, afraid that even holding it might cause its brief life to slip away. For a fleeting moment, a mad thought flashed through his mind: if he ran, if he fled now, if he broke the agreement. But the thought died the instant he saw his wife lying there, exhausted with old sweat covering her forehead, her eyes unfocused, yet still searching for the child. The window opened without anyone touching it. Cold air rushed in, extinguishing the candle and plunging the room into a dim gray half-light. The husband did not need to turn to know who stood there. She did not enter at once. She remained at a threshold, like someone arriving precisely on time, neither early nor late. "It is time," she said, her voice unchanged, as though she were speaking of an ordinary errand. The wife turned toward the sound, her eyes widening in confusion, too weak to speak. The husband wanted to scream, wanted to beg for more time, wanted to say at least let the mother hold the child once, but his throat locked, and the only thing he could do was step forward and hand the baby over, as one delivers something that has already been assigned an owner. She took the child with steady hands, not hurried, not rough. Her movements were efficient, precise, like someone who had done this before. The child did not cry. It did not struggle. It lay still in her arms, its tiny eyes opening to look up at the unfamiliar face with unconscious curiosity. It was that silence that chilled the room. There was no cry to fill the space, no sound to distract from the reality that a life was being carried away. The wife reached out weakly, her hand grasping only air. Her mouth opened, but no words came. "Do not search," the woman said, looking at neither the wife nor the husband. "The agreement is complete." Then she turned, stepped back through the window, and her figure dissolved into the night as though it had never existed. The cold wind ceased. The room returned to darkness and stillness. Too much stillness. The husband stood there with empty arms, the sensation as though a part of his body had been removed without blood. The wife lay motionless, her gaze fixed on the place where the child had vanished, as if staring long enough might bring it back. But nothing returned. The days that followed passed in a warped kind of time. The wife recovered physically, but the house did not. Everything remained: the small cradle she had prepared, the blanket never used, the tiny items that would never be touched. No infant was crying at night, no steady breathing beside them. Only absence, and that absence did not occupy a single place. It seeped everywhere, clinging to walls, to floors, to every silent meal. The wife did not ask much. She did not question her husband. Perhaps she sensed that the answers would bring nothing but more pain. The husband saw the loss every day. He saw it in the way his wife set out an extra bowl at the table and then quietly put it away. In the way she woke at night, her hand instinctively reaching for a small body that was never there. He understood then that the crime had not ended when the child was taken. It had stayed. It lived with them, breathed with them, grew in the pauses between sentences. There was no blood spilled, no open wound. Yet that house had been marked a place where a life had existed and been erased by an agreement the law would never know. And from that moment on, each day they continued living was no longer a normal continuation of life, but a sentence carried out slowly, silently, without end. The child does not remember the moment it was brought to this place. There is no memory of a journey, no image of a door closing behind it. By the time awareness begins, the world is already there, complete, sealed, and offering no hint that another world ever existed before it. The child wakes in a familiar room, eats familiar food, and hears the familiar voice of the woman who has always been there, since before it knew how to ask questions. Everything is too seamless to invite doubt. The witch does not beat the child. Not once. There are no whips, no threats, no sudden eruptions of rage. She does not need them. The child is fed enough to never be hungry, clothed enough to never be cold, and taught enough to never be ignorant. When it is sick, medicine appears. When it cries, the sound is allowed to fade into the air, neither punished nor comforted. No one tells it to stop. No one asks why it cries. And it is this indifference that teaches it something earlier than any other lesson. Its emotions carry no weight. The woman calls it by name, but the name holds no warmth. It sounds like a marker, a signal used to confirm the presence of an object that requires supervision. When she looks at the child, her gaze does not reflect on the child to itself. There is no recognition, no flicker of feeling. Only inspection, the way one looks at a possession to ensure it remains intact, functioning as intended. The child grows under that gaze, learning to stand still when watched, learning to answer precisely what is asked, learning not to wait for an embrace that will never come. No one tells the child this is love, but no one tells them that this is not love either. And with nothing to compare it to, the child accepts everything as natural. It does not know that there are touches meant to reassure rather than restrain, hands placed on a shoulder simply to steady, not to claim. Its body grows accustomed to not being held, not because it is rejected, but because it has never been invited. Gradually, it learns to stand upright without leaning on anyone, not out of strength, but because there is no other option. Some nights, when everything is quiet, the child lies in the dark and feels a vague tightening in its chest. Not pain, but discomfort, as though a space is opening that cannot be filled. It does not know what to call it. It has no words for the sensation. It only knows that even when it has eaten, even when it has learned its lessons, even when it has done everything expected of it, something is still missing. Missing in a way that cannot be pointed to, yet heavy enough to make breathing just a little harder. The witch does not notice this, or does not consider it a problem. To her, the child is healthy, developing, and obedient. All measures are satisfactory. And so she continues to provide, continues to instruct, continues to maintain a distance precise enough that the child does not die, but never close enough for it to fully live. It is a cold balance sustained day after day, requiring no adjustment, no reconsideration. The child is not starved, but it is never full in the deeper sense of the word. It is given knowledge, but not the feeling of being chosen. It is given safety, but not warmth. And because it does not know it has the right to ask for more, it does not resist. It learns to shrink its desires to fit the space allotted to it, learns not to reach out because there is nothing to grasp. The absence of love leaves no open wound. It does not tear flesh. It does not spill blood. It does something more precise. It dries a part of the child from the inside, a little each day. Not enough to cause alarm. Not enough to be noticed. Just enough that if one day there were a moment to look back, it would be clear that some things that should have grown were never given the chance. The child does not know it is imprisoned. It does not think of freedom because it has never been taught that freedom exists. It sees no bars, so it does not imagine a cell. It only knows that its world has limits, and those limits are never questioned. And that is the perfection of this crime, to raise a human being in cold sufficiency so thoroughly that when everything that makes a human is taken away, the victim does not even know what has been lost. The decision to place the child in the tower was not announced like a sentence. It was spoken in the calm voice of someone who believed she was doing what was necessary. The witch did not call it imprisonment. She called it protection, the only way to keep something precious from being touched by the outside world. The child heard those words without fully understanding them, but understood enough to follow. The journey happened in silence through a forest, where light was crushed into fragments by the canopy, where dampness clung to the skin like a thin membrane. The child walked each step, carrying it farther from familiar spaces, yet never looked back because it had never been taught. There was a reason to return. When the tower appeared, it did not look like a structure meant for people. No door, no steps. Only a smooth column of stone, rising straight into the sky, cold and sealed like a tooth growing backward out of the earth. The child looked up its neck, aching from the strained dizziness creeping in before it could become fear, because the witch's hand was already on its shoulder, a touch light, but heavy enough to orient every thought. No one opened a door because there was no door to open. In the next moment, the world closed around the child, not with a crash, but with a quiet shift, as though space itself had contracted and swallowed it whole. A round room revealed itself seamless and contained without sharp edges to grip, without dark corners to hide in. A single high window let light fall in a thin, cold column, not enough to warm, only enough to prove that outside still existed. Everything necessary was already there: a bed, a table, books, and tools. Nothing excessive, nothing missing. A place designed for survival, not for living. The witch said that from now on, the child would be safe, that no one could reach it, that the world beyond was full of things that wanted to take, to harm, to stain. The child nodded, not out of belief, but because it had never learned how to doubt. In the early days, the tower was only another room, smaller, higher, quieter. The witch came and went on schedule, never early, never late, appearing through the window as if stone had no meaning to her. Each visit she inspected everything with the same familiar gaze, health, memory, voice. Each departure she took the last sound with her, leaving behind a silence thick enough to settle. The child began to realize that the tower did not only enclose the body, but time itself. Days had no names. Nights offered no sign of ending. Light always fell the same way, as if the sun had been forced to stand still to accommodate the shape of the room. There was no door to test, and therefore no moment of disappointment when it would not open. There was no exit to imagine, and so the thought of leaving had nowhere to attach itself. The tower needed no bars. It did something more refined. It made the concept of outside meaningless. The child placed a hand against the stone wall, cold and smooth, like touching the skin of a massive creature that did not breathe. Sound was swallowed the moment it was born. Its own footsteps did not echo. Its singing returned faintly and then dissolved, as though the tower allowed sound to exist only long enough to prevent it from becoming a companion. Space repeated itself so thoroughly that movement became unnecessary. Walking a few steps or standing still felt the same. The tower taught this with infinite patience. The silence here was not the absence of noise, but a form of pressure. It pressed against the ears, against the chest, making each breath uncomfortably audible. The child began to speak less, not because it was forbidden, but because there was no one truly listening. Each sentence fell onto the stone floor and died there. Each thought left unanswered gradually shrank, learning to exist inside the mind without ever needing to escape. The witch believed she had created a perfect place: no danger, no intrusion, no disruption. But the tower did more than keep the child inside. It digested. It slowed the heartbeat, dulled sensation, and blunted anything sharp. Time did not pass through the tower. It settled, accumulated, pressed down on the person within like layers of stone. The child was not bound yet. With each passing day, an invisible cord tightened around its capacity to want. Repetition gave memory nothing to anchor to. Prolonged silence gave emotion no sound to break through. And in the place called safe, the crime continued without any further action required. The tower only had to stand there without doors, without exits tall enough to separate a human being from the world, and sealed enough to make that human forget that the world had ever been much larger than this. The nameless days inside the tower begin to erase the very idea of days. The first day is no different from the 10th, and the 500th is only a more worn version of the same mold. The child does not wake because morning arrives, but because the body opens its eyes after a stretch of darkness long enough to demand it. The light falling from the high window remains fixed in the same place, cold and thin, like a thread suspended only to remind that something outside still exists. The child eats when hunger tightens the stomach, sleeps when the eyelids grow heavy, yet every action collapses back into the same closed circle without beginning or end. There are no holidays to anticipate, no special nights to fear. Time does not move forward. It spins in place slowly, grinding down the sharp edges of awareness until everything becomes smooth. There are a few sounds consistent enough to become markers, and what makes them frightening is that they too repeat until they lose all meaning. The sound of hair being pulled is the first. At first, it is only mechanical, the heavy strands sliding over stone, brushing the wall, producing a soft but unmistakable scrape. Over time, that sound becomes the only signal of change. When it appears, the child knows the witch is coming. When it stops, the child knows she is leaving. There is no need for clocks, no need to count days. The hair grows longer, heavier, and the dragging sound slows with the years, as if the single remaining thread connecting the child to the outside world is aging as well. Each time it is heard, the child's chest tightens by reflex, not from fear, but because the body has learned to respond before thought can intervene. The witch's footsteps come next, steady and precise, never hurried, never delayed. They do not echo. The tower consumes them as if stone refuses to let sound live long enough to become memory. The child learns to measure distance by that rhythm, learns to stand still as the steps approach, and learns to loosen when they retreat. Every reflex is sharpened through repetition, without whips, without commands. The tower does not order. The tower trains. The first day resembles the 500th so closely that the child cannot say how old it is. Age becomes a number without an anchor. There are no birthdays to mark it, no visible shifts dramatic enough to announce that the body has changed. The child only knows that its arms are longer, its voice deeper, its hair heavier, but these changes arrive so gradually that they cause no shock. There is no moment of awakening before a mirror, no instant of recognition. Only a dull current, extended and opaque, where each day files away a little more of the ability to notice change at all. Within this repetition, the questions that once flickered quietly extinguish themselves, not because they are answered, but because they find no ground to grow in. Why ask if the answer leads nowhere? Why think that every path bends back to the same place? The child learns to keep its thoughts low, just enough to avoid pain, just enough to exist. It learns not to dream of what cannot be reached, because each act of imagining brings a sharp, uncomfortable tightening in the body, like a muscle stretched too far and forced to release. Eventually, it stops stretching. Singing becomes the only remaining test of aliveness. Each time the child raises its voice, the sound circles the round room and returns thinner, weaker, like a reminder that everything leaving the mouth comes back unchanged. Some days the child sings to fill the silence. Some days it sings to prove it still exists, but even the singing wears down. Notes that once made the chest vibrate become harder to reach, not because the throat hurts, but because there is no reason left to try. The tower teaches that effort produces no difference. Prolonged isolation does not make the child scream. It does something crueler. It makes screaming meaningless. There is no one to hear, no surface for sound to strike and return from, no response to confirm that the noise ever existed. Gradually, the body learns silence as a default state, not the silence of fear, but trained silence, the silence of a being that understands its voice does not alter the world. Time, once stripped of meaning, does not vanish. It becomes pressure. It stacks itself on the child, like neatly placed layers of stone, never collapsing, never leaving gaps. Each layer is a day identical to the last. Each added layer narrows the inner space slightly, not enough to cause panic, only enough to make breathing harder. The child is not destroyed by a single blow. No one makes it bleed. But each day, something very small is taken away quietly, as flesh shaved into slices so thin no blade is required. There is no immediate pain. No sound can escape, only loss. This is how a human being is worn down by nameless days. There is no breaking point to remember, no scar to point at and say this is where it began. Without markers, memory cannot hold. When memory cannot hold, the self slips away. The child still breathes, still moves, still performs what is required, but with each completed loop, it becomes a little thinner, as paper rubbed too long against stone. The tower needs to do nothing more. The persistence of identical days is enough to finish the work. And when a crime is carried out through perfect repetition, the victim never knows when it began, only that they have been here for a very long time and are no longer certain there was ever another place to call the world. The singing begins as a survival reflex rather than a choice. No one tells the child to sing. No one asks for it. But in the tower's prolonged silence, when the only remaining sounds are the child's own breathing and the blood rushing in its ears, the body finds an exit on its own. Without sound, the mind begins to turn inward and tear at itself. Without pushing something outward, everything inside swells until it becomes unbearable. And so the child sings, at first very softly, like an experiment, like a fear of injuring the space around it. One note, then another falling onto the cold stone floor and dissolving. There is no applause, no command to stop, no encouragement to continue, only the brief existence of sound before it dies. Gradually, singing becomes the only way to keep consciousness from slipping out of the body. When the mouth opens and breath is shaped into sound, the child knows it is still here, that the throat still works, that the chest can still vibrate. Some days it sings not for melody, but for breath. Singing to keep rhythm, singing to avoid sinking into a state where everything becomes terrifyingly flat. The earliest songs are those the witch once taught simple melodies, repetitive, safe, but over time they distort. They stretch longer, slow down, carry silences that were never part of the originals, as if the music itself is learning how to breathe inside this compressed space. Sound in the tower always returns. That is the rule. It touches the walls, slides around the circular room, and then comes back to the singer thinner and weaker like a copy drained of blood. But there are days, very rare ones, when the voice rises high enough, long enough, not to be fully contained. The child does not realize this immediately. It only feels the throat burn more than usual. The lungs heat up, as if something has been pushed beyond a familiar limit. That sound finds a way out through the high window, slipping along the current of air, falling into the forest below. Not all of it, but enough. A fragment of voice, a fragment of breath, escaping the tower. The child does not sing to be heard. It does not know if anyone exists beyond the walls. It sings because without singing, the mind begins to loop in on itself, gnawing at each thought until nothing remains but meaningless noise. Singing is the only way to keep the pieces inside from colliding too violently. And precisely because there is no intention to call for help, the song carries a different weight. It is not a clear plea, not the familiar sound of a scream for rescue. It is something more dangerous, a sign of survival extended beyond conditions meant to sustain it. When the voice leaves the tower, it carries what cannot be spoken. It carries nameless days, cycles without markers, questions that died before finding words. It carries an absence rather than clear pain, and that is what makes it haunting. The listener, if there is, a listener, will not understand why their chest feels heavy. They will not hear a complete story. They will only hear a soul trying to keep its shape through sound. Inside the tower, the child does not know that each time it sings, it lets a part of itself slip outside. Not the safe part, not the part controlled by the witch, but the rougher part is not yet fully worn down. Each sustained note is a thin thread pulled from the spool, not enough to form a rope, but enough to prove that something inside has not been entirely consumed. After each song, the child collapses into exhaustion, the throat raw, the mind emptied. Yet within that emptiness, there is a brief moment of relief, as if pressure has been released just enough to survive one more day. The witch hears the singing. She does not forbid it. She does not praise it. She records it as a normal expression, a talent to be preserved within safe limits. To her, the voice is something that can be controlled, restricted by space, by the height of the tower, by isolation. She does not realize, or chooses not to realize, that sound does not obey the same laws as bodies. It searches for gaps. It slips through places stone cannot fully seal. And once it escapes, even for a moment, it carries traces of where it came from. The singing becomes the tower's second rhythm, running parallel to the sound of dragging hair and measured footsteps. But unlike those sounds, it does not signal control. It signals resistance, not resistance through action, but through refusal to disappear entirely. The child sings to avoid madness, but each time it sings, it also exposes a truth. This place is not the only world that can exist. Each time sound crosses the boundary of stone, even partially, the tower fails to fully contain what it holds. In that way, the singing resembles a soul leaving the body for a brief instant. The body remains encased in stone and silence, but the soul slips out, touches free air, then is pulled back in. Each escape leaves a small tear, not large enough to call an exit, but enough to prove that captivity is never perfect. And while the child does not know it is crying for help, the world outside, if someone listens long enough, will begin to sense that the sound is more than a song. It is evidence that a human being is being forced to survive in isolation, and that survival itself is searching, however unconsciously, to be seen. Beneath the tower, the forest is not as silent as Rapunzel imagines when she looks down from above. It has its own breathing, slow and deep small sounds slipping between tree trunks and layers of rotting leaves. The prince hears the singing on such an afternoon after he has wandered farther than intended. At first, he assumes it is only the wind threading through the canopy, a familiar sound people often attribute to imagination. But then the melody repeats uneven, unfinished, carrying the hesitation of someone who sings not to perform, but to endure. He stops. The horse behind him paws the ground, uneasy. The voice does not call a name, does not carry a clear plea for help, yet it pulls at him with a strange gravity, as if someone has exhaled their loneliness and accidentally let it drift too far. The prince has never heard a voice like this. It is not beautiful in a way that invites applause. It makes one want to step closer, if only to be certain it is real. He follows the sound one step at a time, along paths rarely used. The deeper he goes, the clearer the voice becomes, and yet it does not lose its ambiguity. It comes from above, broken by branches, as though space itself is trying to conceal its source. When he sees the tower, his first reaction is not wonder, but dissonance. A structure stands there isolated without doors, without an entrance, without any sign of life, and yet it holds within it a living voice that cannot be denied. The prince remains at the base of the tower for a long time. He looks up, squinting at the small window high above. When he calls out, the singing stops, not in fear, but as if the person above is unaccustomed to being answered at all. The silence stretches long enough for him to believe he was mistaken, that the tower is an illusion and the voice only a trick of the forest. Then Rapunzel appears at the window, her face angled downward, light catching in the length of her loose hair, and it takes him a moment to understand that he is looking at a human being, not an extension of the stone. Their first conversation is awkward and fragmented. Rapunzel is not used to speaking with strangers, much less to someone standing below her, looking up without the familiar gaze of control. The prince does not know what to ask. Every question feels intrusive in this context. He asks why she is there. She answers simply that it is her home. The reply requires no elaboration, and it is precisely the lack of explanation that unsettles him. In the days that follow, the prince returns, not because he has decided to rescue anyone, but because the voice does not leave his mind. Each time he hears it again, he notices how it shifts with the time of day, with the mood of the singer. Sometimes it is light, almost accepting. Sometimes it is taut, like a string pulled too tight. Rapunzel waits at the window without naming it. For her, this is only a new variation within a sequence of identical days. For him, it is the opening of a world he had never imagined. Desire does not arrive in a crude form. It comes disguised as curiosity, as the feeling of having discovered something secret that ought to be protected. The prince tells himself he only wants to listen more, to understand more. He does not think about possessing Rapunzel, does not think about taking her anywhere. But each time he sees her framed by the window, separated from the ground, he becomes aware of a vague wish to be the only one who knows this existence, the only one who stands beneath the tower and listens. Rapunzel, meanwhile, begins to attach meanings to his presence without possessing the tools to test them. The tower has taught her that the world is small, that everything beyond exists only as stories told to her. The prince carries the smell of the forest, the sound of footsteps, and fragments of information about places she has never been. She does not call this hope. Yet each time he leaves the room, feels wider in an uncomfortable way, as if the walls have retreated without opening an exit. The prince does not realize he is stepping into a structure of power that existed long before he arrived. He looks at Rapunzel and sees someone isolated, but he cannot see the invisible layers of control that have shaped how she understands herself and him. When he thinks of climbing the tower, the idea presents itself as a natural solution rather than an intrusion. If the witch can climb it, why can't he? The question carries no malice, but it holds a dangerous assumption that every space can be entered if one is determined enough. Desire disguises itself as salvation in this way. It requires no grand declaration, no loud intent, only a small step forward, justified by concern. The prince believes he is doing the right thing, that his presence is a gift. Rapunzel believes he is proof that her voice has not vanished without consequence. Neither of them sees that this very moment, when one person wants to come closer and the other allows it, is where a new crime begins, not through violence, but through a misunderstanding of freedom. At the base of the tower, the prince's shadow stretches in the afternoon light, blending with the shadow of the tower, until they are difficult to distinguish. Rapunzel looks down, unaware that from this angle he and the tower have begun to overlap. And within that overlap, hope appears fragile and bright enough to obscure the reality that any hope born inside captivity carries a price neither of them is yet prepared to pay. The prince does not climb the tower the first time the thought occurs to him. The idea stays with him for several days, floating among reasons that sound harmless enough. He tells himself that standing on the ground strains his neck, that speaking through open air distorts the voice, that if they could face each other directly, Rapunzel would not tire so easily. These reasons stack neatly, forming a false sense of logic, strong enough to cover a much simpler truth. He wants to enter her space. The first time he calls out in the way the witch does, his voice falters, unfamiliar with the cadence of the words. Rapunzel hesitates for a long time before letting her hair fall, not because she is afraid, but because her body senses that something is shifting. The hair slipping from her hands is no longer just a familiar tool. It becomes permission. When the prince grasps it and begins to climb, Rapunzel remains still feeling the pull on her scalp. Light, but steady, different from the witch's pulls, slower, less decisive, as though each step requires silent approval. The space inside the tower changes the moment the prince sets foot within it, not because there is an extra person, but because the order has been disturbed. This is the first time Rapunzel shares the round room with another human being outside the rhythm of scheduled visits. The prince stands awkwardly, unsure where to place his hands, where to direct his gaze. The room Rapunzel once considered the entirety of the world suddenly feels smaller, not in size, but because it now contains another set of eyes. They do not touch each other right away. The initial closeness takes the form of distance, shortened too quickly. The prince speaks more than necessary, as if afraid that silence might force him to recognize what he is doing. Rapunzel listens and nods, practiced in letting others fill space. Yet her eyes keep drifting toward the window, where her hair still hangs, a reminder that this entrance was not meant for meetings like this. When the prince steps closer, the movement does not resemble an attack. It is slow, exploratory, like a question left unspoken. Rapunzel does not step back, not because she agrees, but because she has never been taught how to refuse within this space. His hand touches hers, light enough that it could be withdrawn at once. But it is not withdrawn, and it is precisely that failure to pull away that marks the point of no return. It is the first time Rapunzel is touched, not to guide, not to inspect, not to control. The sensation is not clearly pleasant or frightening. It is simply different. Her body reacts more slowly than her thoughts, as if searching memory to decide whether this is something to accept or avoid. The prince feels the stiffness in her response, but interprets it in the way most convenient to him, as shyness needing reassurance, not as a boundary that has not been asked about. An invaded space does not cry out. It remains silent, and that silence makes everything appear permitted. The prince believes he is bringing something good, that his presence is an escape. Rapunzel believes this new sensation proves the world is wider than a tower ever allowed her to know. Neither of them stops to ask whether this closeness can exist without causing further harm. When the prince leaves that time, the room does not return to what it was. Rapunzel stands in the center of the floor for a long while, her hand still remembering the touch, her scalp still remembering the unfamiliar pull. She does not know what to call what has just happened, but she knows that from now on, each time she lets her hair fall, it will no longer be a neutral act. Intrusion does not always arrive with violence. Sometimes it comes in the shape of concern that was never requested, of advances justified by good intentions. And once it has happened, the space that was once only a prison becomes something else as well. It becomes the site of an irreversible shift, a place where every feeling that follows, whatever name it later takes, is born from a moment when a boundary was crossed before anyone realized they had stepped over it. After the first intrusion, neither of them names what has happened. Love is not spoken, nor is wrongdoing pointed out. Everything continues under a silence padded with new habits. The prince returns more regularly without needing a clear reason. Rapunzel lets her hair fall without the long hesitation she once had. These actions repeat often enough to become familiar, and that familiarity creates the illusion of safety. Inside the round room, they learn how to exist beside each other, not through grand gestures, but by sharing a space that was designed for one. The prince sits on the stone floor with his back against the wall and tells her about the outside world in scattered fragments, the smell of bread in the morning market, the sound of hooves on dirt roads, feasts where laughter grows too loud. Rapunzel listens with the focus of someone who has never had a basis for comparison. She does not ask why these stories always stop short of real freedom. For her, having someone tell them is enough. Attachment forms quietly. It grows from the way the prince becomes a substitute rhythm for the witch's visits. When he does not come, Rapunzel feels the absence immediately. The space seems heavier. Time stretches longer. She begins to measure days by his presence rather than by light or darkness. It is a dependence without a name, because inside the tower, all forms of dependence look the same. The prince falls into a different kind of dependence. The tower which once unsettled him slowly becomes the only place where he feels necessary. There, he is not a role already defined. He is the bearer of news, the listener, the one who is waited for. The feeling is sweet in a dangerous way. It makes him forget that this relationship exists inside a structure that was distorted from the beginning. He does not see himself replacing the witch. He believes he is different. Rapunzel learns about the world through the words of a single person, and that shapes how she understands everything. When the prince speaks of freedom, she imagines it as choosing who is allowed to visit, not as the right to leave. When he speaks of love, she understands it as a steady presence, not as respect for boundaries. These meanings are not wrong within her circumstances, but they are incomplete. And that incompleteness is something neither of them recognizes. Touch becomes more frequent, more natural, as if the body has grown accustomed to being allowed. Rapunzel cannot distinguish between her own desire and the reflexes formed through years of control. The prince feels her response and interprets it as consent, not out of cruelty, but because he lacks the tools to see the difference. Love in this space has no conditions for health. It grows like a plant in darkness, reaching toward any source of light it can touch regardless of how twisted its shape becomes. They speak of the future in vague sentences. The prince promises that one day Rapunzel will leave the tower. Rapunzel believes him, not because there is a clear plan, but because his voice carries a certainty she has never heard from anyone else. She does not ask how. She does not ask when. Those questions are too large for a world measured by a single round room. Love in distorted conditions does not require lies. It survives on missing information. Both of them believe they are choosing when in reality they are reacting to invisible limits. Rapunzel loves because this is the only relationship that does not openly control her. The prince loves it because this is the only place where the outside world does not impose itself on him. They find each other in the narrow gap between two different systems of confinement and call that meeting destiny. Neither of them thinks about consequences. Inside the tower, consequences are a luxury. Everything is delayed. Small warning signs are ignored the way the witch's gaze lingers longer with each visit, the shift in how she inspects the space, the extended silences after questions that seem harmless. The prince notices but reassures himself that he has been careful enough. Rapunzel notices but does not know how to shape the feeling into concern. That love is not false, but it is built in an environment where freedom is warped, where choice has never been tested under ordinary conditions. It carries genuine tenderness, and with it the seeds of harm. Because when love grows inside captivity, it must always pay for what was taken before it ever began. And that price, though not yet visible, has already started to accumulate quietly in every falling strand of hair, every promise that has not been examined, every moment when both believe they are moving closer to freedom, while in truth they are digging deeper into another form of dependence, subtler and harder to recognize. The afternoon begins like the others. The witch arrives on schedule, her call rising from the base of the tower familiar enough that Rapunzel no longer startles. The hair slides through her hands, heavy and warm, dropping into the open air by reflex, a motion repeated too many times to question. The prince has only just left. The room still carries traces of that other presence, warmth not yet faded, a slight disturbance in how objects were set down. Rapunzel has not had time to restore order when the witch is already there, stepping into the round room with the same measured gait, her gaze sweeping as always, then lingering a beat longer. No one speaks of the difference. The witch inspects as usual, sets down her basket and asks a few brief questions about the tasks completed. Rapunzel answers properly, evenly, as she was taught. She believes she has hidden things well enough that the changes inside her cannot be seen from the outside. It is in that false moment of safety that the sentence slips from her mouth, not as a confession, but as an absent remark, light almost a complaint. She speaks of the hair, of the mild strain she feels when the witch climbs, then adds that it is strange how lately it no longer feels as heavy as before. No name is spoken, no accusation is made, yet the room seems to pause. The witch stops what she is doing and does not turn to look at Rapunzel at once. The moment stretches beyond what could be called accidental silence. Rapunzel senses she has said something wrong, though she does not yet understand why. In the tower, small comparisons were never a problem. She was never taught that some sentences cannot be taken back, that some details, when placed side by side, open a chain of conclusions too dangerous to ignore. The witch turns very slowly. Her gaze is not angry, not confused. It is sharp, focused, as if a missing piece has just slid into place. She asks again calmly what Rapunzel means. Rapunzel stumbles, tries to correct herself, says it was only an idle remark, that perhaps the hare has simply grown accustomed. The explanations do not help. They only sharpen the truth, because only real change requires so many words to conceal it. The witch does not press further. She does not need names or details. In her world, possibility matters more than proof. A possibility that has occurred is enough to break order. She steps to the window and looks down into the empty air, where the hare has just fallen, and in that instant, Rapunzel understands that everything has slipped beyond her control, not because she loved, but because she revealed the trace of another presence. The collapse does not arrive with a shout. It arrives through a shift in how the witch looks at the room. What was once a space of preservation becomes a sight. Every object, every scuff on the stone, every stray strand of hair on the floor acquires new meaning. Rapunzel stands still cold, running along her spine, realizing she is no longer something to be protected, but a risk to be managed. The witch speaks little. She says only that Rapunzel has forgotten her position, that the tower is not a place where unpermitted things occur. Rapunzel wants to say she did not mean to betray, that she was only living, but those words do not exist in the tower's language. Here, there is only order or disorder, and disorder always brings consequences. When the witch leaves at that time, there is no promise of return. No familiar rhythm is confirmed. Rapunzel remains alone in the room, a hand pressed to her chest, feeling her heart race, understanding that what she has revealed is something she was never allowed to have a point of comparison. From that moment on, she does not merely exist in the tower. She has begun to see the world through two different weights, and that comparison, unintended and irreversible, has shattered the silent wall that once protected her. The mistake is not in the words themselves. It is in the realization they exposed that there is another way to be touched, another way to exist, and that realization cannot be withdrawn. The tower still stands intact, but the order inside it has cracked. And once order cracks, punishment is no longer a question of if only, of when. The witch does not return on schedule. That is the first sign, though Rapunzel only understands it later. There is no familiar call rising from the base of the tower, no waiting rhythm to give her time to prepare. The witch appears as if she never left, stepping into the round room with a silence so dense the air seems to thicken. Rapunzel rises too quickly, the chair scraping against the stone floor, that small sound ringing out like a belated confession. The witch studies her for a long moment, not with the usual inspecting glance, but with an appraising stare, the way one looks at an object that has changed shape without permission. She does not ask about the prince. There is no need. Yesterday's sentence has already done its work. Everything else is procedure. She steps closer and reaches for the hair. The movement is neither hurried nor angry. It is precise, coldly exact. Rapunzel does not yet understand what is happening when the blades close. The sound of metal meeting metal is not loud, but inside the round room, it is sharp and final. The hair falls onto the stone floor, heavy as a piece of the body severed without warning. Rapunzel does not scream. She stands frozen, the sudden lightness on her scalp sliding down her spine, leaving behind a hollow sensation with no name. The witch continues, not out of rage, but because the task must be completed. Lock after lock of hair drops away, piling into a useless mound of pale gold. With each cut, a possibility is erased. No more rope, no more familiar path, no more predictable rhythm of visits. Rapunzel understands then that punishment does not require explanation. It only requires an action clear enough that no one can mistake its meaning. When the hair is no longer long enough to reach the floor, the witch stops. She steps back, surveys the result, the way one looks at finished work. Rapunzel lifts her hands to her head, touches the short remnants, and for the first time in her life, feels that she no longer belongs to the image the tower created. This loss is not cosmetic, it is functional. It is the removal of the only role she was ever given. The witch says, that Rapunzel has chosen. The words settle onto her like a sentence rewriting the entire history. Rapunzel wants to protest, to say she was never given a choice, that everything she did was a reaction inside a narrowed world, but such words have no standing here. In the witch's logic, broken order must be restored, and restoration is never gentle with the one deemed responsible. The window opens in a way Rapunzel has never seen before, not to let someone climb in, but to force a person out of the place that once held them. Light floods in too harshly, making her squint. The outside world does not appear as a promise, but as a trial she has not been prepared for. The witch does not throw Rapunzel down. She does not need direct violence. She compels her to go to leave the tower on legs that have never been used for such a purpose. The moment Rapunzel crosses the threshold, the world does not open its arms. It simply exists, vast and indifferent. No walls to lean against, no ceiling to define limits. Everything is too large, too much, and without instruction. The witch remains behind, not watching for long. The task is complete. For her, punishment is the restoration of order, not the survival of the punished. On the other side of the tower, the prince arrives too late. He calls Rapunzel's name, his voice rising upward and falling back into space. When he grasps the hair and begins to climb, he does not register the difference until it is irreversible. The pull is unfamiliar. The strands are short, uneven, and unable to bear weight. The slip happens quickly, allowing no correction. The fall does not end at once. His body strikes stone slides downward and is caught by thorny brush growing close to the tower's base. Pain spreads unevenly, as if each part of him is reporting damage on its own schedule. When he hits the ground, the world is still there, but it has begun to distort. Light fractures into unstable fragments, then collapses inward, leaving a blur in which he cannot be sure whether he is still seeing or only remembering. The witch looks down from above and says nothing. The punishment has been released. It does not stop with cutting hair or exile. It continues in consequence, traveling with those forced to leave, carrying the tower inside their bodies. Rapunzel walks into the forest without turning back, not out of courage, but because she does not know what more she could endure if she looked again. The prince lies at the foot of the tower, breathing hard, feeling his sight abandon him piece by piece. Two people are pushed in opposite directions, carrying the same crime that has been set free, no longer contained by stone walls. Punishment does not end with the act. It begins there. And once the crime is released from its original confinement, it no longer needs a hand to guide it. It finds its own path forward, clinging to memory, to the body, to the years ahead, to prove that some distortions, once they occur, will never return to their original silence. The fall does not end at the ground. It continues inside the prince, spreading slowly like ink bleeding through water. Not explosive, not violent, but impossible to stop. As he lies motionless at the foot of the tower, the first thing he loses is not consciousness, but certainty. The world is still there, yet it no longer holds its shape. The light does not go out all at once. It bends, contracts, as if someone were slowly drawing a curtain across his eyes, inch by inch, leaving no room to resist. He tries to blink, but the motion changes nothing. What lies before him pales outlines, dissolve the boundary between stone trees and sky slipping away. There is still brightness, still the sense that it is daytime, but no way to be sure what he is actually seeing. This is blindness that does not arrive all at once, that does not allow for a clean panic, because it comes carrying the cruel hope that it might be temporary. That hope is the sharpest part of it. He calls Rapunzel's name. His voice travels outward, lost in the open space, and does not return. He calls again louder, but the sound comes back warped, as though the forest is answering in a language he does not know. As sight fades, his hearing sharpens. He becomes aware of the wind, the brush of leaves against one another, even the ragged rhythm of his own breathing, a sound that had never mattered before. The senses begin to rearrange themselves, not to adapt, but to signal the old order has collapsed. He tries to stand, The ground can no longer be trusted. He steps wrong, collides with a tree, and feels the rough bark scrape against his palms. The world now has to be read through touch, through sound, through memory of shapes he can no longer see. Every step is a test, every movement a question of whether he still commands this body. Blindness does not take life immediately. It takes confidence, the thing that once allowed him to move without thinking. He sinks again, his back against the tree, forcing himself to stay calm. In his mind, Rapunzel's face appears without sharp detail, yet still painful. He does not know where she is, whether she is alive, whether climbing the tower was salvation, or simply another kind of intrusion disguised as love. These questions do not need light to exist. They circle endlessly in the new darkness with no exit. Time behaves differently without sight. A minute can stretch like an hour can vanish without a trace. He does not know how long he sits there before forcing himself to rise again. He cannot remain here. Survival instinct, which needs no noble reason, pushes him to move. He begins to walk with no direction, no destination, guided only by the sense that standing still would mean accepting an end. Each step is a negotiation with fear. Fear of falling again, fear of wandering deeper, fear of never finding his way back to the human world. Above all, fear of admitting that he has lost the thing that once defined him. The prince was a hunter, a rider, someone who saw far and acted quickly. Now he is a body feeling its way through space, asking the ground for permission with every step. Elsewhere, Rapunzel is undergoing another kind of blindness, not of the eyes, but of direction. The forest opens before her, dense and indifferent. There are no paths, no signs. Everything looks the same, impossible to distinguish. She walks not because she knows where she is going, but because stopping would allow fear to catch up. Every sound in the forest might be a danger or nothing at all. That uncertainty erodes her as quickly as hunger ever could. Two people, two forms of blindness, begin their journeys of loss, at the same time, not together, unaware of each other's present existence. The tower remains behind them, silent, as if it had never been the center of the tragedy. The witch has vanished from the story, yet the imprint of her hands remains, needing no presence to continue its work. For the prince, darkness is not merely the absence of light. It is the necessity of learning the world again from the beginning without guidance. He learns to tell morning from night by temperature, by bird song. He learns to sense danger through unnatural silence. He learns to accept that some things will never return, to how they were. Blindness is not a moment. It is a process each day, erasing a little more the memory of how easy seeing once was. And through that process, one thought clings to him, relentless and unforgiving. The fall was not an accident. It was a consequence. Not because he loved, but because he entered a space that was not his believing good intentions were enough to justify the act. Darkness is now where he must live with that question without light to distract him. The fall ends vertical motion, but opens another descent, longer and quieter, stretching across the years to come. And when the eyes no longer see other things, sharpen into focus memory, regret, and the truth that some wounds do not need blood to become permanent. The 7 years do not begin on a specific day. They begin at the moment the prince realizes he is still alive after the fall, and that this is not mercy. It is a sentence stretched over time. When he leaves the base of the tower and feels his way into the forest, step by step, darkness does not crash down like a trapdoor. It stays, patient. It follows him like a companion he cannot refuse. Light still exists somewhere. He senses it as warmth on his skin, but it no longer serves to orient him. The world becomes a series of disconnected sounds, a map drawn from wind-running water and sudden collisions that teach the body to fear before the mind can understand why. In the early days, he still counts. 1 day, 2 days, then 10. He marks time by hunger, by the fatigue settling into his muscles, by noticing how his clothes wear thin at points of constant friction. But counting soon becomes meaningless. Without a schedule, without a destination, without anyone waiting, time does not flow. It settles. Morning and evening differ only by temperature. Weeks pass without leaving a clear trace, as though 7 years are merely one endlessly stretched day. The prince learns to survive at a minimum level, no longer hunting, as before. He lives on what he can gather, on the reluctant assistance of strangers when he dares approach them. But most of the time, he avoids people, not because they are cruel, but because their gaze, though he cannot see, it can still be felt in the prolonged silence that follows each inquiry. He becomes a wanderer, a dislocated voice, a body meant to be stepped around. The world does not need to drive him away. It only needs to keep moving without making room. Darkness teaches him lessons he never asked for. It teaches him to listen to silence, to know when danger is near. It teaches him to read changes in the ground beneath his feet, to avoid falling. It also teaches him how to face memory, because when there are no new images to occupy the mind, the past grows louder than ever. Rapunzel appears in those gaps, not as the girl in the tower, but as a question without an answer. If he had not climbed, would things have been different? If he had stopped sooner, would anyone have been hurt less? There are no answers, and darkness offers no hints. It simply keeps him there, forcing him to live alongside assumptions that cannot be tested. Each time he thinks he has accepted it, another memory surfaces, sharper than the last, reminding him that acceptance is not an ending, but a process that must be repeated every day. Some evenings he sits beside a stream listening to the water and wonders whether Rapunzel still sings, whether that voice exists somewhere in the forest, or whether it vanished along with the stone tower behind him. Meanwhile, Rapunzel enters her own 7 years, not marked by darkness, but by exposure. The forest does not shelter her. It only allows her passage if she is persistent enough. In the first days, she survives on luck and on pity. Later, she survives by learning faster than fear. She learns to tell harmless sounds from those that signal danger. She learns to find water to find food, and more importantly, to not remain too long in one place, because standing still gives memory time to catch up. She does not know whether the prince is alive. She does not know what the fall took from him. She knows only that the tower is no longer behind her, and that this is both release and loss. Freedom arrives without instructions. It does not tell her where to go or who to become. She enters villages with wary eyes, takes work no one else wants, sleeps in places no one bothers to name. The outside world does not wait for her, but it does not chase her away either. It allows her to exist on the condition that she does not ask for too much. The 7 years pass along two parallel trajectories, never crossing, unaware of one another, yet carrying the same heavy rhythm. For the prince, darkness becomes the default state. For Rapunzel, the memory of the tower becomes a shadow that never leaves. Both change in ways invisible from the outside. There is no dramatic transformation, no moment of awakening. Only steady abrasion, wearing down what was once sharp until it becomes rounded, not because it is healed, but because it has been used too much. By the 7th year, the number itself no longer holds meaning for either of them. It exists only so the story can later name the time that has passed. In reality, there is no marker to signal that a phase has ended. Darkness does not announce when it thins. The forest does not warn when it is about to open into something else. 7 years are simply the sum of countless days in which both wake and continue living, not from grand hope, but because there is still no reason strong enough to stop. And in that continuation, without heroism, without victory, the story preserves its cruelest truth. A crime does not need to be repeated to keep existing. It lives in habit, in the way two people reshape themselves to fit a world that has been permanently altered. 7 years in darkness do not create redemption. They only create enough distance that when light and song finally meet again, neither will be what they once were. Rapunzel enters exile, not through a door closing behind her, but through the realization that there is nowhere left to return to. The forest releases her at the edge of a small village where houses cluster close together, as if for warmth, while the gazes remain cold. She arrives with worn clothes, short hair that no longer shields her, and a body that has learned to keep moving without knowing the destination. She does the work no one else wants, trading strength for food trading, silence for a temporary place to sleep. Each day resembles the last. In one crucial way, it does not allow her to stop. The change in her body comes quietly first, as morning nausea, as fatigue that far outweighs the labor she does, as a growing heaviness in her abdomen she does not dare to name. Rapunzel once lived in a tower where everything was controlled to the point that understanding was unnecessary. Here, in the open world, she must piece the signs together herself. When the truth emerges, it does not arrive with dramatic fear, but with a dense, weighted silence. She sits for a long time by the village well, a hand resting on her stomach, realizing that freedom has handed her a responsibility she cannot refuse. She has no one to ask for counsel, no one to confide in. The villagers look at her as a potential burden, another mouth about to appear. An old midwife confirms what Rapunzel already knows, her voice neutral, neither judging nor promising. "It won't be easy," the woman says, and it is the kindest sentence Rapunzel receives for many months. From that day on, everything grows heavier. She moves more slowly, is paid less, and is gradually pushed to the margins of any work that offers shelter. When she can no longer afford a place to stay, she moves into a narrow room at the edge of the village, where the walls are thin and the floor is cold. At night, she hears her own breathing differently now, no longer the familiar rhythm she once knew. Her body changes day by day, and with it comes a nameless fear. Fear of childbirth, fear of not having enough to eat, fear that the child will enter a world already prepared to look away. Yet beneath those fears lies something undeniable. She wants the child to live. The desire is not noble, not carefully reasoned. It is simple, reflexive, like gripping the only thing left that still carries meaning. The day of birth is not marked by ritual or careful preparation. It arrives on a rainy night when the village is silent and no one wishes to leave their bed. Rapunzel manages more than she ever believed she could. The pain is not as people describe it in stories meant to frighten. It is a series of connected trials that force her to focus so completely that there is no room left for fear. When the first cry sounds, the small room seems to change, not brighter, but fuller. Then comes the second cry. Rapunzel lies there, exhausted, two small lives resting against her chest, realizing that her exile has doubled. The children arrive, not as a reward, but as the continuation of a chain of consequences. She does not ask why. The larger questions were left behind in the tower long ago. She counts breaths, touches warm skin, and understands that from now on, no decision will belong to her alone. The days that follow settle into a new rhythm, harsher than before. She returns to work sooner than her body allows, because there is no alternative. Children cry, grow hungry, fall ill, and grow not by magic, but through the weary persistence of a mother who has no margin to collapse. Rapunzel learns to divide bread into smaller portions, to sleep in fragments, and to hide her tears, so the children will not be afraid. She sings again, not to summon anyone, but to keep her own tempo. The song is lower now. It does not travel far, but it is enough to fill the room on cold nights. Exile is not being cast out once. It is a prolonged condition, one in which each day confirms that you do not fully belong anywhere. Rapunzel lives between the village and the margin, between necessary and surplus. She is not welcomed, but neither is she chased away. The world allows her to exist on the condition that she does not ask for ease. And within that condition, she does the only thing possible. She continues. Somewhere else, the prince is still learning how to live with darkness. Rapunzel does not know this, and the story does not reunite them yet. Between two parallel exiles lies a quiet common ground. Both are paying a debt for decisions made in a space that was never fair. Giving birth in poverty does not erase the crime that came before, but it turns consequence into a living reality, present every day, impossible to forget. This stretch of exile has no climax, no dramatic punishment. It is heavy because of its regularity. It is haunting because there is no clear exit. And in the small room where rain taps its rhythm against the roof, Rapunzel understands that freedom, when it arrives without guarantees, can be harsher than any tower. They meet again, not in a moment arranged by fate, but in a narrow crack of ordinary life, where neither of them is searching for anything grand anymore. Rapunzel is moving through a small market, one hand gripping each of her children's, her eyes alert in a way that has long since become instinct. Vendors' calls, the smell of food, and the clatter of metal against metal form a dense layer of noise. And inside that noise, there's a voice off-key, uneven, but so familiar that she stops before she understands why. The voice is no longer clear, no longer able to rise. It is rough, worn down by time and deprivation, but the rhythm is right, an old song from the tower. The notes she once sang to remind herself she still existed. Rapunzel turns slowly, as if afraid that moving too fast will cause the sound to disappear. At the edge of the market, leaning against a stone wall, stands a thin man in worn clothes, his clouded eyes aimed at no one in particular. She recognizes him, not by his face, but by the way he lifts his head as he sings, as if he still believes light might answer from somewhere. His name leaves her mouth before she weighs it. It is soft, almost soundless, but enough to make the man stop singing. He turns toward the voice, listening not with his eyes, but with the absolute focus of someone who has learned to live in absence. When he speaks her name in return, his voice hoarse from long neglect of words that matter, Rapunzel knows this is no mistake. Time has not erased this recognition. It has only made it hurt more. They stand there amid the flow of people not touching at once. The distance between them is not measured in steps, but in years lived apart. Rapunzel sees the scars on his face, the way his body leans slightly to one side, as if always bracing for a fall. The prince, no longer a prince in bearing or position, listens to her breathing, hears the familiar fatigue in it, and the small footsteps beside her. When he asks about the children, the question is not an interrogation. It is simply a way of setting the world back into place. Rapunzel answers plainly. She does not tell the whole story, only enough for the truth to stand. The children watch the man before them with cautious curiosity. He kneels slowly so they can get used to his presence. When he extends his hand, not touching, yet only waiting, Rapunzel realizes something has changed. The man who once climbed the tower no longer assumes his actions are permitted. That does not erase what happened, but it creates a different space, small, fragile, where all three adults can stand without causing further harm. Healing, if it can be called that, does not arrive like a miracle. There are no tears that wash the past away. There are long silences where they do not know what to say and do not need to. Rapunzel feels her heart tighten as she realizes that his presence brings both relief and the return of memories she had buried deep enough to survive. The prince, hearing her speak of exile, of childbirth and poverty, does not try to justify himself. He listens, and in that listening, there is a quiet form of remorse. They try to live near each other, not as reunited lovers, but as people carrying injuries. Some days pass normally, so normally that Rapunzel almost believes the past has retreated. Then there are nights when she wakes in panic, because the space feels too tight, the darkness too familiar, and he sits up without touching her simply to let her know she is no longer alone in the tower. For him, sudden brightness can still trigger fear, because his mind does not fully trust that his sight has partly returned. He learns to move slowly, to ask before touching, to stop pretending that he is whole. The children become a quiet anchor. They do not understand their parents' past in full, but they understand the new rhythm of life. They ask simple questions, and sometimes that simplicity forces Rapunzel and the prince to pause to admit some things cannot be fully explained. They do not try to build a prettier story than reality. They only try not to lie. The incompleteness of healing shows itself most clearly in moments that seem small. Rapunzel never allows the door to be fully locked. The prince never sits with his back completely turned toward an exit. They learn to live with these habits, not as failures, but as signs of having passed through something that cannot be erased. Love, if it still exists, is no longer a promise of rescue. It becomes a daily agreement to continue once each day, that though the past cannot be fixed, it does not have to be repeated. This reunion does not restore perfect balance. It does not return. The lost years does not dissolve the crime, but it creates a meeting point where two people broken in different ways recognize that they do not need to be whole to stand beside each other. They only need enough honesty not to turn survival into a denial of what happened. And in that incompleteness, the story enters another phase, not gentler, but less lonely. Healing, if it exists at all, is not a return to what once was. It is learning to stand in a new shape, carrying the cracks, and accepting that some crimes, even when they no longer continue, leave echoes that last a lifetime. Their lives continue, and that is the most unsettling part of all. There is no thunderclap, no clear sign announcing that everything has ended or begun anew. Each morning resembles the one before it, closely enough to create a sense of safety, yet differs just enough to remind them that the past has never truly left. None of them lives in the tower anymore, but the tower has learned how to live inside them. Silent, persistent waiting for moments that seem harmless enough to speak, Rapunzel wakes each day in a room with low windows where light enters easily. And yet on some mornings, the sound of wind slipping through a crack still makes her jolt, her heart racing before reason catches up, to remind her she is no longer confined. She moves freely, but her steps unconsciously measure the distance to the nearest exit. No one asks this of her. Her body remembers on its own. Years of enclosure taught it that safety is not a default state, but something that can be taken away at any moment. Her hair grows long again, slowly at first, then faster, as if time is trying to compensate for what was cut away. Rapunzel no longer holds scissors each morning, yet every time she brushes her hair, a chill still runs down her spine. The hair is no longer a tool, no longer a rope, but memory does not care about present logic. To memory, anything that was once a weapon can become one again without warning. The prince lives in a world that is no longer fully dark, but never truly bright. His eyes see, but they are no longer trustworthy. Some afternoons light disorients him, forcing him to stop, close his eyes, and breathe until the world settles again. Some nights darkness arrives sooner than expected, and his heart pounds as if the fall is still happening, endlessly prolonged. He learns to move slowly, to listen to the ground, and to never rely completely on any single sense. The world for him is always something that must be verified. They built a home that is not a tower, but not entirely comfortable either. Rapunzel never allows the door to be fully locked. The prince never sits with his back turned entirely toward an exit. These things are never spoken, never negotiated. They exist as unwritten laws, shaped by injuries that do not need to be named to be respected. And it is in these small details that it becomes clear what happened did not die with the witch, nor did it vanish when the tower was left behind. The children grow up in a space filled with love, but not with carelessness. They sense the vigilance in their mother's voice, the hesitation in their father's movements. They do not know the whole story, but they know some questions should not be pressed too far. In nights when the light should not be too bright, silences that must be left undisturbed. Rapunzel and the prince do not mean to pass on fear, but fear, like memory, does not require invitation to persist. The crime of this story no longer resides in a single act, a moment of violence, or one wrong decision. It lives in how people continue afterward, in how they love while remaining cautious, in how they protect while fearing they might become controllers themselves, in how they struggle not to repeat the past, yet are still guided by invisible scars. None of them is entirely innocent, and none of them remains whole enough to become a perpetrator again. Rapunzel has days when she feels truly free. Then there are days when a narrow room or a stretch of darkness is enough to bring the tower back. with such clarity that she must brace herself against the wall to remember where she is. The prince has days when he walks, steadily trusting his eyes. Then there are days when a single misstep is enough to stiffen his entire body, as if everything is about to collapse once more. This story does not close with the triumph of light or the disappearance of darkness. It stops at a point less radiant but more honest, a place where people who have survived continue to live not because they have overcome everything, but because they have learned how to exist alongside what cannot be erased. The crime no longer unfolds, but its imprint remains quiet, and enduring a reminder that some things, once they have happened, become part of the story forever, even when no one speaks their names again.